This is the Peri Peltz Show on Sirius XM. Here's your host, Peri Peltz.
Welcome, everybody. We're so glad that you could join us for this hour. It's incredible. Since we were last together, we have had a presidential election. We now have a president-elect in Joe Biden, and yet we have a president who has yet to concede. We have a country that feels more divided than ever. We are heading into a second or third wave of the coronavirus pandemic, however you want to define it, a winter that is fast approaching and some frightening times it seems ahead when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic. So today we decided that we're going to talk a little bit about where we are politically with Axios's Jonathan Swan. Then we're going to talk about how to heal with Rabbi Irwin Kula. And then a glimmer of hope with vaccine news that's come out of Pfizer in this last week with Dr. Jacob Appel. Matt O'Neill, my partner on Axios on HBO, is with us. Matt is an Emmy Award documentary filmmaker and always pleased to have him join us for the hour. First, we're going to begin with Rabbi Irwin Kula. Irwin Kula is a seventh-generation rabbi. He is a disruptive spiritual innovator, a rogue thinker, and author of the award-winning book Yearnings, Embracing the Sacred Messiness of Life. Irwin is president of Klal, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, which works at the intersection of religion, innovation, and the science of human flourishing. And Rabbi Irwin, it's always so good to have you here on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be here. Really good to be here.
You know, Irwin, we were just talking before we went on the air. These are really challenging and difficult and divided times. People are scared and don't know what's coming. And COVID is on the rise in a very significant way. Busy time in the religion space, huh?
Yeah, I think it's a busy time in any space where people are trying to navigate the world. I mean, I think it's a really complicated time in the religion space, but it's a pretty complicated time in the airline space. It's a pretty complicated time in the business space, in the banking space. It's a pretty complicated time, in the transportation space and the education space and the parenting space. I think that, somebody said the other day, I was listening, said this is the first complexity crisis in the history of the human community. So we've had a lot of crises, but a complexity crisis is everything is interrelated and everything is also a system. So you have systems interrelated with systems. And so that is new. And part of the complexity crisis is everyone holds on for dear life to their own positions. And everyone is scared, like you said. I think the fear is genuinely real. And so what do you do? What do we do in our spheres of influence, in our communities, in our organizations, in our businesses, in our politics to mitigate that fear so that we can actually be in this together? And that's a big challenge. And it's a challenge all up and down the food chain from whoever we think is on top of the food chain to whoever we think is on the bottom of the food chain. Every single person, every single day can contribute to what I'm calling reweaving, finding the fierce thread that holds us together. And that's a big job. Now, we accomplished one thing. It's very important to get the madman and the tyrant out of position. And that is a tremendous accomplishment because you can't do anything with the tyrant on the throne. But it actually doesn't solve anything. It gives you space to actually address the issues. And now we'll see. It's going to be a big job. It's not like poof, Biden comes in, everything's better. There's a lot of things that we have to do.
It's interesting, Irwin, when you say that and the phrase, the madman, the tyrant. One of the things in the aftermath of this election, trying to think through the 70 million Americans who voted for President Trump and feel differently, certainly don't think he was a madman or a tyrant.
Well, many of them do, actually. I mean, I think this is one of the big things. I think that the only important thing about the 70 million, 75 million, or 72, 77 is that it's a number for a snapshot dealing with one thing, the election of the president. I don't think we should make any other generalizations. We should allow those numbers to disappear. And anytime any side imagines they have an explanation for the 70 or 72, the 75, the second you have that explanation, take a deep breath and know that explanation is blocking the truth. Whatever the truths are, it's blocking the truth. Generalizations at this moment will block the truth. All of us have neighbors, all of us have friends, all of us have colleagues. I have donors, I have students who voted for Trump. And to be profoundly curious about what motivated them, and there are so many different motivations, And the urge to immediately generalize, whether it's on the editorial page of the New York Times or on Fox or on MSNBC, the urge to generalize is our need to make order of something that is uncomfortable for us. But the thing is, we have to lean into the discomfort. We have to lean into the polarization. We have to be curious about the whoever we experience on the other side. And that's a hard job. Biden, by the way, in his first, let's say, 4 or 5 moves, has done that perfectly. Now, whether he'll be able to sustain that, I don't know, but he's done it perfectly. Either we are all in this together or we're not. Now, if we're not, that's a separate issue. Then we should really begin to think about the civil war we're going to happen, how people are going to protect themselves, how is blue and red going to separate rural and urban. And that may be in the cards. We don't know. It may well be in the cards if you look at the stacking of identities and the siloing identities and the clustering identities. But it doesn't have to be that way. That's going to be our choice of how we look at whoever the them is.
How do we lean into that polarization? I mean, as these days get shorter and the rhetoric increases, I'm tired of polarization. And I imagine many people listening are tired of that polarization. What are the actions that we can take that lead to healing that is also leaning into that polarization?
So here, number one, of course, we're tired of polarization because we actually haven't been leaning in. All we've been doing is exhausting ourselves, right, with the terrible sort of the destabilizing emotions. So one, right, polarization is actually a initially good thing. It just like when you have an argument with your spouse or you have an argument with a colleague, right? Arguments are the way in which we slowly move together in the world, okay? That's one way to say it, or we sort of ascertain the truth. So the problem isn't the polarization. The problem is handling the polarization. We've done something very classic. We have split, right? Splitting in psychology, right, is you don't look at your own shortcomings. You don't look at what you're ashamed of inside. You don't look at what you're guilty inside, but you split it away because it's too painful and you disassociate and you project it on the other. So the first rule in polarization is not to look at what's wrong on the other side, but first, what am I possibly wrong about? 2, what is the other side, again, not wrong about? That's easy, right? What is that other side possibly right about? Now, when you do that, all of a sudden, and that means you have to be curious. You have to be curious about yourself. I wonder why I feel this way. I wonder why I'm triggered this way. I wonder why I was doing a podcast the other day on the relationship between science and religion, which is a fraught relationship. And one of the people said, I just don't understand. Like, how can these people be creationists? And I said, because you don't understand, this is not a science argument. This is an argument about beliefs and worldviews and how my world hangs together. So try to imagine that you may be missing something about the other person's view, and then try to imagine where you're missing something about your own view. That creates these aha experiences. And aha experiences, they're amazing. Aha experiences elevate you, energize you so that you can actually deal with the polarization in a healthy way. Now, it's hard to do, just like think of a marriage. Think of in a marriage when we get into that sort of, she's the bad person, I'm the good person, she's the angry person, I'm the calm person, whatever it is, where the other person becomes sort of the container of that's the racist, right? That's the primitive person. That's the homophobic person. That's the imagine non-college educated white people. Imagine saying that 40 million people, that's how you define them. Anytime you define people into a box that way, it is always because you're trying to get a handle on something that's uncomfortable internally to you, right? Now, then we can play around what are some of those things. Like if I'm thinking about this and I realize that, I wonder what it must be like for people to watch their culture, right, be completely undermined, to have their economic base completely undermined, right, and to be pigeonholed as. Now you begin to think that way and say, gosh, it must feel kind of funky to feel that way, right, as opposed to a little compassion, a little empathy. So curiosity and compassion is the way in which polarization becomes energizing and constructive.
You know, when you talk about polarization in the way that you just described, it actually does make me think about the book that you wrote now quite some time ago about the sacred messiness of life, and that life isn't really lived in the binary. Life is really lived in that gray, and it feels like that theme is playing out right now in a really profound way.
Yeah, but it's hard to live in the gray. We have to begin to see the gray as all the colors, as opposed to the gray as sort of a drab alternative to the black and white. It's that we live in color. And it turns out, here's what we do to all people everywhere, in relationships, in communities, in cultures, and all people do. We all injure each other and then try to repair. We injure each other and repair. That is how we walk through life together. We injure each other, not because we're bad people, but because it's hard to walk together in life with people. Injure each other, and then we try to repair. Now, there's been tremendous injury over the last, now we can date it 30 years, 40 years, we can date it 3,000 years, we can date it 200,000 years. We have injured each other quite a bit. And so one of the questions to ask is, in the group that I'm part of, whatever group that is, where have we unintended, perhaps injured other people, right? And it's not because we're morally bad, it's because life is complex and there are unintended consequences to behaviors, right? So globalization is both wonderful, but many, many people got injured. Some people really, 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 really benefited, right? The explosion of voices in the culture. Oh my God, it's so amazing, the explosion of new voices. But as voices explode into the scene, some people who thought they had a voice don't have a voice the same way anymore. And that's very complicated. So we have so many people injuring so many people. And then we do have two things that I think we're going to all have to sort of own. And one is that there has been exploitation of the polarization that has led to the split, led to the hardcore splits. One is, the algorithms of the media are designed right now to ensure splitting, because splitting is the business model. And I get it. It's not even their fault. I don't know what the business model would be. To create a business model in which you're not splitting people so that you get their most dynamic, excited, fearful affect and their tribal belonging. I don't know how to do that. I think the media has a very significant question. But we have a significant question, too, on literacy, on how not to be polarized, not to be split by an algorithmic business model. And then the political class is problematic at the moment, and they'll have to rise to the occasion. I'm hopeful because the next generation, not the 75, 80-year-olds who are, although Biden's a little bit better, when you look at the vets who are both Democrats and Republicans, they, probably because they've been in foxholes with whoever they disagree with politically, they're much more mature and much more grounded in being aware of these splits. And they're very hopeful. They very rarely demonize on TV when they're interviewed, even when they disagree with the other side.
It's an interesting point you bring up there, Irwin, vis-a-vis the political leadership, really in both the Republican and the Democratic parties, right, that they're, dare I say, sclerotic. The leadership in the late 70s, early 80s has been, to a certain degree, the generation that has been, with the exception of President Obama's 8 years, right, the generation that's been leading the country since the early 90s.
Yeah, I think there's profound. I mean, if you wanted me to do a sort of a psycho-spiritual analysis of the leadership class at that age, and I'm just a little younger, so I'm not judging it.
We don't want to judge based on age, but there is a real.
I think there's profound amount of shame and guilt about having. I know even I'm going to turn 63 in another couple of weeks, and I always experience myself as like sort of young and sort of on the transformation side of things. And lately, I've had these feelings of, wow, it's remarkable how hard I worked and didn't accomplish as much as I thought. It's remarkable how much good work I did that really didn't make a difference. It's remarkable how much, and that is a very, very unnerving feeling. It comes in the Jungian stage. So there is a Jungian stage of harvesting your hubris. So I get that, but it's also, if you're not careful about it, it can produce a sort of paralysis or a lashing out guilt, as opposed to understand, wow, with all the work that I did, the truth is there's a lot of very serious injured people I've been in Congress for 35 years. I've been a senator for 40 years. I've been the head of the judiciary for 20 years. And given all the power I had, it is remarkable how much hurt there is in the culture. And I think to own that is a really significant thing. I'd love Biden, not tomorrow, but to get up.
But Irwin, can I jump in for a second? Because when you talk about the president-elect, how do you come into, first of all, you have a president right now who has yet to concede. The division.
He'll concede.
Will he concede?
Yes. Everybody, this is part of the drama of the tyrant, and he's doing his thing. And these are old sort of slay the dragon myths. And you can see already yesterday there were two more senators and 4 more people here. And Senator Langford already said.
Let's take that as a given.
Yeah.
However, that being said, you have a president-elect who's going to assume office where he is governing an incredibly divided electorate. How do you even start to...
One, they're not as divided as we think. 70% of Americans agree on the 2 or 3 first policies in every major complex issue. Okay, it's called. There's a language in the sociological literature called exhausted majority. I don't know if you ever heard that term. Who's the exhausted majority? The exhausted majority is Matt's first question. We're so tired of, right? And there's so many people and we're tired of the polarization. That 70% is tired of the polarization. And if Biden handles it right, and this is the one time when it may be experience and being an uncle, grandfatherly type may actually work. He has to move to help the most vulnerable people across the board, right? Help the most vulnerable people in small incremental steps that 70% agree on. And most of the top steps, 70% people agree on. And he has to be very clear that he's educating everybody all the time. We all agree on this position. We all agree on this policy. And where we don't all agree, we're not moving forward, because better to move forward together slowly than to increase the splitting. And that's the judgment I think that Americans voted for. We want to move together. And if you look, the most important thing at the voting patterns is not 70-75. It's the anomalies. Anomalies are always where there's something to learn. What are the anomalies here? Right? It turned out new voters and Black women are the only category that voted for Biden sort of in large numbers, right? Everybody else moved. There was all of a sudden 18% of Black males. The LGBTQ doubled its numbers in voting for Trump. What is that about? Being curious about that and not immediately saying, well, those must be self-hating people who actually hate being gay, right? Or those are self-hating Black people who, hate Black women, Black males who hate Black women. To immediately go to these polarizing, all the polarizing explanations do is it confirms who you are in the drama. The thing is to help everyone understand it's not who you are in your own drama, it's who we are collectively in the drama of the country. And so Biden really could do that. And you could see he's doing it. He's trying to say, don't worry. We're going to do it. Don't worry. We're getting what we need today. Last night he said, don't worry, we're getting what we need. We'll be able to move the country. And work on the priorities that are really important. Even the science thing he's doing first, right? Beautiful comment about the masks, because what he did is he took the other side's insight that individual liberty is a really serious problem. There's a lot of coercion in the country. A lot of people feel coerced, either by the culture or by the government, okay? And that coercion produces a kind of Trump response. He's saying, I know it's individual freedom. I know it feels like a constraint. But I want us to imagine that it's a constraint because you love your grandparents. It's a constraint because you love your teachers. It's a constraint because you care about your health workers. You see what he does? He takes the truth of the others, the partial truth of the other side, and uses that in the argument, as opposed to saying, you sons of bitches who don't give a shit about anybody, right? You're just selfish people who, carry AR-15s and don't wear masks and come to rallies to kill people. That's not a helpful way to talk about them, right? Always being alert to how we're immediately categorizing is a way of understanding it's something inside of us that we don't want to process that's not allowing us to find that thread that connects us.
You mentioned President-elect Biden's turn to science, and it reminded me, I was struck when Peri was introducing you, the phrase, the science of flourish. And I wonder, on a more micro level, could you give us some advice on how to flourish right now? How can I flourish? Because as these days get shorter and shorter, we enter into winter, we look at that COVID map of the country and it's turning redder and redder. Help me flourish.
I'm going to give you three things. If everybody will do these three things, right? And you know what? I know this, Peri has helped me in my career, right? Because always from the very beginning, before radio, before television, before anything that I knew her about, she would always ask me a question like this at a table that I was having dinner. And so I always think about this now, not just for the show. I always think, here are three things. One is, at the end of every day, you should be able to do these three things. One is, ooh, I'm pretty grateful for that. I don't care what that is, okay? The more specific you could be, the better. So not thankful in general for health, but thankful for my friend. I knew she was in the hospital and so grateful or grateful. You know, my wife made me that meal today. Grateful. One, by the way, not 100. Let's start with one or two things at the end of the day. Two, something that you could say, I never thought of that before. That is curiosity, okay? Gratitude and curiosity. So at the end of the day, it could be something small. You know, I just never thought of it that way. Yikes. I never thought that might be why that person did that. Oh my God, I never realized, right? So curiosity, gratitude, curiosity. And then at the end of the day, I helped somebody. I call it, that's serve. Gratitude, curiosity, and service. Okay. Not service. I transformed the whole world and there's no more poverty in the whole world. No. Somebody's life was made better because of me today. Not better that his life is perfect and he's now, the most happiest person in the whole wide world. No, I made that. I visited that. I called that person on the phone who was sick. I made that donation to something. I exhibited a kindness. Three things: gratitude, curiosity, and service. And you know it because at the end of the day, before you go to sleep, you say, yeah, wow, yeah, I'm grateful for, yeah, wow. I never thought of that.
Let me ask you a question then. We often talk about visiting the gratitude tree, right? We know that doing service is something that's profoundly important. But why is that going to help us in this particular? Because
it turns out that those three things are a direct attack on polarization and the splitting, right? So gratitude, literally, we know, here we know from a physical, we know what gratitude does to blood pressure. We know what gratitude does to stress. We know, so the stress of polarization, the stress of examining yourself, you really have to be able to have a ground of gratitude. Think of gratitude as like when you prepare the earth for flowering, for seeding. You can't seed in uncultivated ground. It doesn't grow. Gratitude turns out to be the psychic sort of grounding where we can grow new stuff. And we have to grow a lot of new stuff. We have to emerge into sort of new sorts of human beings in new sorts of relationships. Gratitude is the fertilizer of the emergent, one could say. So that's one. In terms of curiosity, the problem with polarization is the splitting. The splitting is, I can't learn anything from you. You can't learn anything from me. I know exactly who you are. You know exactly who I am. But the thing is, I don't even know exactly who I am. That's what we know from Psychology 101. There's a too muchness to my own psyche. So forget about someone else's psyche. There's a too muchness to the experiences of my own life to process, yet alone to process encounters with other human beings, yet alone to process in a 320 million person culture. So curiosity and actually learning, feeling something new about something and someone opens up the possibilities. So that's the curiosity. In terms of service, okay, this is Nietzsche who says, happiness, right, points outwards. We all know that experience, that if there's a lot of injury in the culture, we all have to be involved in repairing. And when you repair, we all know how we feel when someone takes care of us, when someone serves us, when someone does us a kindness. It can last for hours and hours and hours, yet alone. Sometimes it's a kindness that shapes our life forever. And it's a small kindness and the person doesn't even know they did it to us and it shaped our life.
Thank you. That's such useful information. And that's something that I think people can do in a really tangible way. And I'm excited, Irwin, to introduce you to our next guest, because I know that you're a fan. And
I am a big fan.
I really want to introduce you to Rabbi Irwin, but Jonathan Swan is joining us now. Jonathan is the national political correspondent at Axios, covering both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Jonathan, Say hi to Rabbi Irwin.
I want to tell you something. We're living in a moment in which, and you don't have to answer anything here, that we just talked about how the media is exploiting the polarization and the splitting. And I understand it's the business model. And I think there's a half a dozen people in the United States who are interviewing people and of being curious in their interviews in the country who never split and try as best they can given the environment. And I've said this to Peri, so I'm not just saying it to you. I've written it to her, that I think that you really are one of the people doing it. I don't know if it's because of your way, that your accent, the softness in which you do it, and yet you're fierce. I don't know. I don't know. You're obviously very smart, but you never make the person on the other side look like a bad person or demonized. Sometimes the person may do it to themselves, but you never do that. And you never triumphant when that happens. You have no idea what that means to the culture.
Oh, that's the nicest thing. That means a lot to me. And what I think about interviewing is too often it's about combat and about sort of point scoring. And I just find those interviews terribly unsatisfying. So I'm trying to do that. So it means a lot to hear you say that.
Literally, we just had this half-hour conversation about how do we heal the splitting that's happened. And if an interview can be about a sort of genuine curiosity, even if you're disturbed by the person, genuine curiosity and authentic curiosity as opposed to combat, the person watching, now we have to train people to watch that and be excited about it, but the person watching it doesn't turn off the television more combative, but turns up saying, I never thought of that. And I never thought of that may be the single most important thing we can all be doing sort of day in, day out. And that's what you do. So anyway, it's an honor to meet you. And thank you for introducing.
Oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate that.
And I just want to let everybody know before you go, Irwin, where can people learn more about the work you're doing and the wonderful work that you're doing?
Yeah, so the place to go is klal.org, O-R-G, and they'll see all the stuff we're doing in polarization and pluralism and spiritual entrepreneurship, et cetera, et cetera.
Just want to let everybody know that Rabbi Irwin Kula, a seventh generation rabbi, is president of Klal, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, and definitely worth checking out and learning more about the wonderful work he does, because it always makes you feel better.
This is the Peri Peltz Show. Here's your host, Peri Peltz.
Our next guest is Jonathan Swan. Jonathan is a national political correspondent at Axios. He covers both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. He is also a frequent reporter on our show, Axios on HBO, which you can check out on HBO Max. But Jonathan has interviewed many people, many politicians on both sides of the aisle, and we're so psyched to have Jonathan with us today. Jonathan, what a treat to have you on our show today. It's just
Thanks for having me.
Always. What a crazy moment we're in.
Yeah, we're in this bizarre situation where even as the president is still publicly proclaiming that he won the election and it's stolen and he's fighting it and whatever, he's simultaneously making private plans to start a 2024 campaign, to start a digital media, paid media network of some description, and is also acting in the way that he's empowering his staff in a way that suggests he understands he only has 2 months left in the job. They're settling scores. They're firing people at a rapid, haphazard pace at the top level of the Pentagon and across other agencies. So it's truly bizarre.
It takes a certain level of cognitive dissonance on everyone's part, right? It feels like the transition team from Biden's campaign is at once condemning the president's actions, but also forging ahead as if everything was perfectly normal.
Right. But there's also this other more serious component to it, which is that the Biden team, transition team, has been shut out of the normal procedures and even resources that are normally afforded to an incoming president-elect. So Trump, it's a technical thing. We don't usually hear about it, but the GSA has not actually certified the result, which means that the transition doesn't exist. And so, we've been reporting out, there's this bizarre situation where you've got foreign leaders calling into U.S. embassies around the world and the State Department to try and connect with the Biden team or offer their congratulations, and are being told, well, no, there is no president. The State Department does not recognize the president-elect. The congratulations are sort of being held in abeyance until further notice. So it actually is more serious because the government he's running is not acknowledging the transition because they're not allowed to. And so the Biden team is not actually, this could have national security implications potentially.
And they're not getting their daily security briefing, which generally the president-elect would be getting, correct?
That's my understanding. I haven't actually reported that part out, but that is my understanding.
And I was also reading that the presidential security detail that would usually be transitioning to take over for President-elect Biden's security is not released to do so. He still has Secret Service security because of his status as the nominee, and also obviously because he's a former vice president, but has not started transitioning to the actual presidential security service.
Yeah, that's another part that I haven't reported on. I know that I don't think there's anyone who's concerned about Biden's safety as a result of his personal safety. I think they've set up protective air zone above Delaware, and that dimension of it, I don't think is the top of the list of concerns.
So, Jonathan, how do you figure it? Irwin was just talking about this. And he said, of course, he's going to concede. Of course, that's going to happen. You're already seeing kind of the breaks that would indicate that that's going to happen. What are you seeing based on your reporting?
Well, it depends how you define concede. Is he going to give a gracious speech to the nation in which he acknowledges that he was defeated in the election fair and square, and that, he wishes Joe Biden the best, and please, I'll invite you into the White House and do what Obama did for him and what George W. Bush did for Obama. And by the way, I'll sit politely through Joe Biden's inauguration. I suppose, at some point pigs might learn how to fly, but none of that seems possible to me. At some point, I expect the way he's going to do it, the off-ramp, just based on his private conversations at the moment, is going to involve him talking publicly about what he's saying privately, which is that he's going to run again in 2024. I broke that story earlier this week. He's talking about that already with his advisors. What I believe Trump will do is set up a PAC, campaign, literally announce his campaign for 2024, assert his dominance over the Republican Party, ensure that his selection, Ronna McDaniel, continues to run the Republican National Committee, freezes in place the 2024 Republican field, and generally sort of hovers over the party for the next 4 years.
That's interesting, Jonathan. So as we go, where is your reporting focused right now? What are you trying to do to move? And we talk about Axios wanting to sort of pitch the reader, the viewer forward. What is it that we need to be focused on?
Well, I've been focusing I think there's lots of areas that are worthy of focus, but personally what I've been focused on is what Trump is actually still doing to the government that he still runs, that he still has the supreme power over. So, for example, yesterday I broke a story about what he's doing at the Pentagon. This should be something that people should be paying really close attention to. So part of he has cleared out in the last 3 days pretty much the entire civilian leadership of the Pentagon, just cleared them out. And he's put in their place Trump loyalists, people who would not normally, in a normal universe, be in leadership positions in the Pentagon. But he made an even more extraordinary appointment yesterday. He put in as the senior advisor to the acting Secretary of Defense a fellow named Douglas Macgregor, retired Army colonel. Douglas Macgregor is a signal to the Pentagon that Trump is fed up with them, in his mind, slow walking his desires to pull troops out of the Middle East. And so he has brought in a guy who has said that America needs to pull out of Afghanistan immediately, including the embassy, that America needs to pull out of Syria, that America needs to basically completely get out of the Middle East and do it tomorrow. He's also a man who has called for martial law on the US-Mexico border and has said publicly that the way to deter undocumented immigrants from coming across the border is to shoot them. He has also criticized Germany for being too welcoming to quote unquote Muslim invaders. So you have a sense of Douglas McGregor, but this is a man who now has, huge amount of power inside the Pentagon as the senior advisor to the acting Secretary of Defense. This matters because President Trump is still the president, and you could already cast forward to Biden, which we're doing, and we're trying to figure out what his transition team is doing. But he's still the commander-in-chief of this country. And I think people need to be paying close attention to what he's doing at some of these agencies, particularly the Pentagon.
So, we're looking at 60 to 70 days, right? I can't remember exactly where we're at right now before inauguration. Is your sense that the structural changes he's making, these personnel changes, could lead to history changing or world changing presidential actions in this next 2 months?
Well, I think Trump would like them to, particularly, as I just mentioned, pulling out of Afghanistan, pulling out of Syria, et cetera. But it's going to be harder than that because these orders need to be executed by the uniformed military. And you have a huge amount of institutional resistance to pulling out on the time frame that Trump wants. Like, he has told advisors he wants all the troops home by Christmas from Afghanistan. If there's one thing the military is good at doing, it's slow walking an order it doesn't like. So I think if you're laying bets on this, you wouldn't be stupid to bet on the military waiting out Trump for the next 2 months, and there to be troops coming home, but probably more on the timetable that was previously planned, not on the accelerated timetable that Trump wants. But I think it's glib to rule it out, because if he gives this order in a forceful way to Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and it's a legal order, I'm not going to rule out that Milley wouldn't, haul the institution, into shape at a pace to get it done. I think it's glib to dismiss that possibility.
Right. Although moving 8,000 troops out of Afghanistan,
it's 4,500 roughly.
4,500,
and this is not going to be Saigon. It's actually, kind of not as hard to do. I mean, it's hard, but from what I understand, talking to people there, it's not impossible.
So, Jonathan, before we let you go, and we so appreciate your time, I just want to let everybody know that in the last show that we did for Axios on HBO, which aired this last Monday night, Jonathan, just give a little bit of a tease about a really terrific interview that you did with Representative Ro Khanna from California, because it really is worth checking out.
Well, yeah. So Ro Khanna is a really interesting guy. So he's a progressive from California who's part of the Progressive Caucus. The reason he's an important person to talk to right now is with Nancy Pelosi having a slimmer majority, the Progressive Caucus has more power. So they have the capacity, if they so choose, to operate more like the Freedom Caucus did in the Republican Party, blocking Pelosi, controlling, which legislation gets through, basically being the bane of her existence. My sense from talking to Ro Khanna is temperamentally, they're just not inclined to behave that way, to be as sort of fire and brimstone as the Freedom Caucus did. But I think they are going to try and assert themselves. And it's going to be a really interesting tension, because you have moderate Democrats in the House who are frankly fed up with progressives in the Progressive Caucus for flirting with concepts like socialism and defund the police and other slogans that they believe cost them seats in this recent election. So I think you're going to see really interesting intra-party tensions that could really drive some big wedges inside the Democratic Party.
Yeah, no question about it. And I think what was so great about that interview is the representative talks about it in a very candid and very open way. And it was a wonderful interview, and everybody can check it out on HBO Max, Axios on HBO. It's a little bit of a shameless self-promotion, but if you can't do that on your own radio show, then when you do it. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. And you can follow Jonathan on Twitter at Jonathan V. Swan, one word. Jonathan, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
This is the Peri Peltz Show on Sirius XM. Here's your host, Peri Peltz.
Dr. Jacob Appel is our next guest, and we're always happy to have him here on the show. He is the Director of Ethics, Education, and Psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine, where he practices psychiatry and teaches medical ethics. And his research focuses on the history of medicine, including the health of American presidents. Dr. Appel, always a treat to have you here. And obviously big news this week, as we heard from Pfizer, about the fact that they have a vaccine that they say is 90% effective. That's a really high rate of effectivity. And wondering if you could just place it for us. Where are we as this country waits for a COVID vaccine?
Well, the short answer is, and I don't mean to dampen people's enthusiasm, but I am cautiously pessimistic on two fronts. Once,
Jacob, just that's really deflating.
Sorry. So I think the first thing I want to emphasize is that we don't know what 90% effective means.
Right.
We don't know whether 90% effective means that the large percentage of people who have mild to moderate symptoms or are asymptomatic with COVID don't get sick at all, or if that means that we actually reduce significant morbidity and mortality. It could be that the death rate is exactly the same and we're simply making the healthy people healthier. So until we have the numbers, it's really hard to be that enthusiastic.
When would you expect to be able to see that kind of data that would allow you to have a better sense of where we are?
Well, I think they're saying they're going to try to bring an emergency use petition before the FDA fairly soon in the next few weeks, maybe the next month. So I think the FDA is not going to approve a new vaccine without that data, and I imagine it'll be public then. So we're on the cusp of knowing a lot. And I don't want to be that discouraging. I think the good news is there's some indication that at least there may be the biological potential for a vaccine, which we've sort of taken for granted, but was not guaranteed.
That's a really good point. And you know what, Dr. Appel, it's worth talking about for a second, because there's a lot of discussion about an mRNA vaccine, but there's never been one. Can you give us vaccine 101, most simplistic, educate us a little bit about what we're even talking about?
Sure. So the history of vaccination has been a step-by-step process, dating really back to the days of Jenner and the use of other illnesses like cowpox to create vaccines for smallpox. And right now, there are a number of different mechanisms for creating vaccines. The one that we're most familiar with is using inactivated pathogen, so an inactivated form of the illness that you inject and then generate antibodies. The mRNA vaccines use a different mechanism that will also generate antibodies through particulate matter. The downside of the mRNA vaccines, which I want to emphasize, is the process for storing them and transporting them, because the chemical products break down very quickly. So the last estimate I heard was that you'll need a temperature between -70 and -80 degrees Celsius for the Pfizer vaccine. And it's a little bit warmer, but still substantially sub-freezing for the Moderna vaccine. And when you think about how hard it's going to be to transport something or store something at that temperature, not just in the United States, but in the developing world as well. I just heard the Philippine health minister basically say that as of now, they have no way of storing things at that temperature. And that's going to be an international problem.
Absolutely, and a real problem as we think about this notion of distribution, something that you're talking about. So great news, right, it seems, is that there may be a vaccine. It may be quite effective. However, lots of unknowns, as you point out. What are the challenges vis-a-vis distribution?
And I will emphasize the largest challenge of all, before we even get to distribution, is assuming the vaccine is 6 months away from mass distribution, and the pandemic's most significant damage is going to be done in the next 6 months. We're really not that much further ahead now than we were last week before we knew this. The analogy I'd like to draw is at some point during World War II, it became quite clear the Allies were going to win and the war was going to end. However, millions and millions of people died around the world as we mopped up that process. And unfortunately, there is the risk that tens or even hundreds of thousands of people will die around the world in the next 6 months while we bring the vaccine to larger audiences. So I think the major challenges are, just like we talked about the lack of PPE and supply chain issues for preventing spread of disease, it isn't that you simply put the vaccine in a thimble and mail it out to people. You need to have glassware that can contain it. You need to have syringes, pipettes, a whole system of material to store, and then inject the vaccine. And as of now, we do not have nearly enough of that to make the vaccine go around.
Talk to us then about distribution. If we're 6 months away from a point where we can even begin the distribution process, how long will it take for people to get it? And you talk very wisely about equity issues that are involved in this as well.
So, and I should emphasize, it may be that a smaller number of people, healthcare workers, frontline workers, can get the vaccine much earlier, maybe even by the end of this year. But that's going to be a small percentage of the people who need it. I think one issue that we need to think about in terms of equity is domestically, internally. If we know the vaccine is effective, do we give it to healthcare workers first, people on the front lines? Will that, on the one hand, help people save more lives, or will it create the perception that healthcare workers get unfavorable treatment? Do we give it to elderly, vulnerable populations in nursing homes and care facilities first? And between states, will we have a mechanism that every state gives out vaccines in the same way, or will you have a higher likelihood of getting a vaccine in a similar condition, depending on what state you live in, which would be problematic? And then I want to emphasize one more domestic concern, which is just as COVID has inequitably affected communities of color and low-income individuals and individuals who historically have had less access to healthcare, there is the concern that the traditional mechanisms for giving out a vaccine, whether in a hospital or an outpatient clinic, are exactly the mechanisms that historically have been more challenging for those populations. We want to make sure to avoid that.
Right.
And then there's the international issue, which is even more concerning to me. There is the COVAX regime, which is designed to make sure that all the world's countries that have opted in, and I should say almost every country in the world has opted in. The outliers are Russia, Belarus, Malaysia, Kazakhstan, and the United States, I believe, as well as a few small islands in the Pacific. Everybody else has bought into the COVAX approach, which says that 3% of every country's population will have access to the vaccine early on through an international consortium. But 3% is a very small threshold for the people at risk in a lot of countries. And there's no guarantee that 3% will mean equitable distribution or will go to the most high-risk individuals in these nations. If you think about the issues of inequity in the United States and who would get 3%, which I am not convinced would go to the people most in need here, you can wonder whether that's really going to happen in a place like Eritrea or Equatorial Guinea.
So what is the information, Jacob, that you want our listeners to understand about the news that we've heard coming out of Pfizer? What about the other companies who are also in this mix, creating a vaccine, developing a vaccine? What do we need to know as people who are obviously worried, concerned about their families and looking towards a moment when we might return to normal? Whatever that is. I don't even know what that is anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it will probably be a different normal. As exciting as the Pfizer vaccine may be, I remind people that Betamax VCR was also exciting and lots of people bought them and they did not become a consumer success. So we don't know not only whether this is going to be highly effective, but whether or not other vaccines may actually prove more efficacious or easier to distribute. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I believe, only requires one shot, not two. Some of the viral vector vaccines, like AstraZeneca's, may be stored at refrigerated temperatures rather than Kelvin level temperatures. So we want to make sure we don't start distributing one vaccine in a way that discourages the important trials we need to do in others that may actually save more lives. Because once the vaccine is out there, people may rush to get it rather than agreeing to be in clinical trials. We need to figure out whether other alternatives are better. So if I had a take-home message for people, though, it's a much, much simpler one than that. My take-home message is we don't know that much more now than we knew 2 weeks ago. And what we knew 2 weeks ago is we were going to have a very hard winter, and there are non-vaccine related ways of making it a much better winter. The one thing this should give people is it should give them hope to know this is not going to go on forever. And it gives them more reason to forego Thanksgiving this year because they won't endanger their family and they'll be able to celebrate Thanksgiving next year, which I think for most people does seem a high likelihood at this time.
Jacob, your use of analogies stretching from World War II to the consumer embrace of Betamax and helping to clarify vaccine distribution is astounding and so deeply appreciated.
Oh, we always appreciate it. And Jacob Appel, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. Where can people learn more about the work that you're doing or follow you on any of on social media? How can they find you?
So if they go to my website, www.jacobmappel.com, they can read links to all of my columns on COVID-related matters.
Great. Dr. Jacob Appel is the Director of Ethics Education and Psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine, where he practices psychiatry and teaches medical ethics. And Dr. Appel, it's always a joy to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
And that's our show for today. I want to thank all of our guests, Jonathan Swan, Rabbi Irwin Kula, and Dr. Jacob Appel for bringing their thoughts and their insights. Of course, always want to thank our wonderful producer, Jen Silverman, and our audio engineer, Mark Aflalo, for being with us and making it all sound so good. You can follow Matt at Matt O'Docs on Twitter, and you can find me at Peri Peltz on Twitter as well. These are challenging times. About that, there's no doubt, but we want everybody to stay healthy, stay well. And of course, we hope to see you back here next week. Until then, everybody, stay well.